Cole Hansen was a farmer who had dedicated his life to the land that had been in his family for generations. For him, it wasn't just a plot of soil to grow crops, it was a piece of history, a legacy passed down from his grandfather, and the foundation of his livelihood. Nestled in a quiet, rural area, his farm was surrounded by rolling hills, dense woods, and open fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was peaceful, removed from the chaos of the modern world, and Cole had worked tirelessly to maintain it that way. The property was everything to him, a sanctuary he had rebuilt after years of wear and tear. He spent long days tending to the crops, repairing fences, and making sure every corner of his land was as productive as it could be. The morning started before the sun had risen, and his evenings often ended under a sky full of stars. It was a demanding life, but one he loved deeply. Cole's closest neighbor, Mason Reed, owned the adjacent property. Mason had a reputation in the area for being overly ambitious and pushy. While most of the other farmers lived with a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect, Mason had always been an outlier. He was a businessman first and foremost, someone who seemed to see land not as a home or a source of livelihood, but as a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited for profit. The two had kept their distance from each other for years, their interactions limited to the occasional wave or polite conversation at the feed store. But Mason's attitude had always rubbed Cole the wrong way. There was a smugness about him, an air of entitlement that Cole couldn't ignore. Still, Cole had no reason to get involved in Mason's affairs until now. It started on an unassuming morning, as Cole made his usual walk along the perimeter of his property. He was checking the fences, ensuring that they were still intact after the previous night's storm. That's when he saw at a gate that hadn't been there before. The gate was crudely installed, its hinges bolted to the wooden posts of Cole's carefully maintained fence. It connected his land directly to Mason's property, opening onto a dirt path that Mason had clearly started carving through the edge of Cole's fields. Tracks from a large tractor or other heavy equipment were visible, cutting through the soil that Cole had recently tilled. Cole froze, his mind racing to comprehend what he was looking at. He walked closer, inspecting the structure. The gate was brand new, with no sign of wear. It was sturdy, built with steel bars, and had a latch that could be locked from Mason's side. It wasn't just a gap in the fence, it was a clear, deliberate move to create access to Cole's property. Frustration bubbled up as Cole paced back and forth along the fence line. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple mistake. Mason had built this gate without asking for permission, without even informing him. Cole felt the insult like a slap in the face. It wasn't just about the gate, it was about the principle, the complete disregard for his rights as a landowner. He knew Mason well enough to understand that this wasn't an innocent oversight. Mason was calculated, always looking for ways to expand his influence, and now it seemed like Cole's farm had become part of Mason's next plan. But what that plan entailed, Cole didn't know yet. Cole took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising anger. He couldn't let this go unnoticed. After snapping a few pictures of the gate and the tire tracks with his phone, he headed back toward the house. There were too many questions swirling in his mind. Why had Mason done this? What gave him the audacity to think he could take such liberties? And most importantly, what was he planning to do next? By the time Cole reached his front porch, he had made up his mind. He wouldn't sit back and let Mason walk over him. If this was Mason's attempt to claim part of his land, Cole needed to stop it before it escalated. But first, he wanted to hear Mason's explanation. Later that afternoon, Cole drove his old pickup truck down the dirt road to Mason's property. Mason's land was less organized than Cole's, a sprawling mass of fields and barns that seemed thrown together without much thought. Mason himself was outside, standing near one of his tractors, when Cole arrived. As Cole stepped out of the truck, Mason looked up and gave him a broad smile. "Cole, what brings you over?" Cole didn't bother with pleasantries. "What's with the gate you put in my fence?" Mason's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly, betraying a hint of calculation. That. Yeah, I figured it'd be more convenient for both of us, a shortcut. You've got all those trails running through your land, and I thought it'd be nice to have a way to access them without going all the way around. Cole clenched his jaw. You didn't think to ask first. Well, I figured it wasn't a big deal. It's just a gate. Didn't think you'd mind. It is a big deal, Cole shot back, his voice firm. That's my property, Mason. You don't get to just decide what to do with it. Mason sighed, holding up his hands as if to calm the situation. Look, Cole, I get it. You're protective of your land. I respect that. But honestly, I don't see what the harm is. It's not like I'm taking anything. The gate's just there for convenience. Cole shook his head. That's not how this works. You don't build something on someone else's property without permission. I want that gate gone, and I want it gone now. Mason's expression hardened slightly, the smile fading. Let's not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. If it's about money, I'm happy to compensate you for the trouble. It's not about money, Cole snapped. It's about respect. Take it down. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension palpable. Then Mason shrugged, his tone turning dismissive. I'll think about it. Cole didn't like the sound of that. As he drove back to his farm, he felt the weight of the encounter settling on him. Mason wasn't going to back down easily. That much was clear. And if Cole wanted to protect his land, he'd need to be prepared for a fight. The next morning, Cole Hansen woke with the same unease that had settled in his gut the moment he first saw the gate. The conversation with Mason Reed had gone exactly as he'd expected, dismissive, vague, and non-committal. Mason wasn't going to remove the gate just because Cole asked. No, Mason would need a reason, one backed by more than anger or principle. Cole's first step was simple but essential. He headed to his filing cabinet, a weathered metal box tucked in the corner of his study, where he kept every important document related to the farm. Among the stacks of old receipts, tax records, and equipment warranties, he pulled out the deed to the property. He carefully unfolded the yellowed paper, running his eyes over the legal jargon until he reached the boundary description. According to the deed, the property line was ironclad, extending well past the spot where Mason had installed the gate. Feeling slightly reassured, Cole snapped a picture of the deed with his phone before returning it to the cabinet. But he knew this alone wouldn't be enough. If Mason was bold enough to install the gate without permission, there was a chance he might try to twist the facts. Cole needed more than just paperwork. He spent the next few hours walking the perimeter of his land, taking note of anything unusual. The tracks leading from Mason's property to his own were clear, deep grooves carved into the soft soil by heavy machinery. They cut through one of Cole's pastures, trampling the freshly sprouted grass that had just begun to recover from winter. He took photos of the tracks, zooming in on the tire treads and the damage to the ground. What struck Cole as odd, though, was that the tracks didn't stop at the gate. Instead, they continued deep into his property, winding toward the far end of his fields. Following them, Cole soon stumbled upon an area where the soil had been disturbed, as though something heavy had been dragged or dumped there. It wasn't part of his active farmland, but it was still his property and someone had clearly been using it. As he knelt to examine the disturbed earth, he noticed something glinting faintly in the sunlight. It was a small metal object, partially buried in the dirt. He brushed it off and held it up to inspect. It was a broken chain link, the kind used in industrial equipment or heavy farming machinery. It didn't belong to him. Cole's unease deepened. Whatever Mason was doing, it wasn't as innocent as he claimed. The gate wasn't just a shortcut, it was access. Access to what, Cole didn't know yet, but he intended to find out. That afternoon, Cole made a call to a local land surveyor, an older man named Tom Wiggins, who had helped his family years ago when there had been a dispute about a neighboring property line. Tom was reliable, thorough, and most importantly, honest. When Cole explained the situation, Tom didn't hesitate. I can be out there tomorrow morning, Tom said. We'll walk the lines, check everything against the records, and see where things stand. If there's anything fishy going on, we'll catch it. The call gave Cole a small sense of relief, but his unease lingered. That evening, as he fed the livestock and checked on his equipment, his mind kept circling back to Mason's dismissive attitude. Mason had acted like he was doing Cole a favor, but Cole knew better. Mason wasn't the type to act without reason. If he'd gone to the trouble of building the gate, carving out a dirt path, and bringing in heavy equipment, there was a purpose behind it, and it wasn't convenience. The following morning, Tom arrived just after sunrise. He was a wiry man in his 60s with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor. Armed with maps, measuring tools, and a GPS device, he and Cole spent hours walking the property line. As they worked, Tom confirmed what Cole had already suspected: the gate was entirely on Cole's land, as were the tracks and the disturbed soil. "This isn't even close to a shared boundary," Tom said, shaking his head. "If he's claiming otherwise, he's full of it." Tom also noticed something that Cole had missed. Near the disturbed soil, there were faint tire marks leading off toward another section of Mason's property, specifically an area where Mason had recently begun construction on a large barn. It wasn't unusual for farmers to build barns, but something about it didn't sit right with Cole. Mason already had multiple barns on his property, and this new one seemed unnecessarily large. "Whatever he's up to, it looks like he's using your land to make it happen," Tom remarked. That evening, after Tom left, Cole decided to pay Mason another visit. This time he brought a folder containing the deed, the surveyor's findings, and the photos he had taken. He wanted to make it clear that Mason's actions weren't just disrespectful, they were illegal. When Cole arrived at Mason's property, he found his neighbor standing by the newly constructed barn, overseeing a group of workers unloading materials from a flatbed truck. Mason spotted Cole as he approached and greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Back so soon?" Mason asked. Cole didn't bother with small talk. He held up the folder. "This is everything I need to prove that what you're doing is out of line. The gate, the tracks, the damage, it's all on my land, Mason, and I've got a surveyor's report to back it up." Mason's expression didn't waver. He crossed his arms and tilted his head. "You went through all that trouble for a little gate?" "Cole, I think you're blowing this way out of proportion." "It's not just a gate," Cole snapped. "You're using my land, you're damaging my property, and if you don't stop, I'll take this to the authorities." For a moment, Mason said nothing. Then, to Cole's surprise, he let out a low chuckle. "The authorities? Come on, Cole. We're neighbors. There's no need to drag outsiders into this. We can handle it like adults." "Then take the gate down," Cole demanded. Mason shook his head slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. "You don't see the bigger picture here, do you? That land of yours, it's got potential. More potential than you're using it for. I'm just trying to make the most of it. Hell, if you'd let me, I could make you an offer. Something that'd benefit both of us." Cole's stomach turned. "I'm not interested in selling." Mason's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't give you a chance." Cole left Mason's property more determined than ever. It was clear now that Mason had no intention of backing down. If anything, his arrogance and cryptic comments suggested he was planning something much bigger than Cole had anticipated. That night, as Cole reviewed the photos and survey documents once more, he noticed something strange. In one of the photos of the disturbed soil, there was a faint outline of a rectangular shape buried beneath the dirt, something he hadn't noticed in person. It was too defined to be natural. The discovery sent a chill down his spine. What was Mason hiding? And just how far was he willing to go to take what didn't belong to him? The days following Cole's tense confrontation with Mason were anything but quiet. The gate remained in place, and the tracks cutting through Cole's property deepened, as if Mason was doubling down on his intrusion. Despite the surveyor's findings and his growing pile of evidence, Cole felt the situation spiraling out of control. Mason wasn't just ignoring him, he was escalating the conflict in subtle but deliberate ways, daring Cole to push back harder. The first sign of this escalation came 2 days after the surveyor's visit. Cole woke early, as always, to tend to the livestock and begin his morning rounds. As he walked toward the eastern side of the property, where Mason's gate had been installed, he noticed something new: heavy tire tracks leading past the gate and deeper into his land. These weren't just the shallow imprints of a tractor, they were deep grooves, made by something far heavier. Whatever Mason's people were driving had cut through Cole's field, tearing up the fresh soil and leaving behind chunks of flattened grass and trampled crops. Cole followed the tracks to the disturbed soil he'd noticed earlier, but this time, the area had been further disrupted. The dirt had been freshly turned, as though someone had been digging there. Cole knelt and ran his fingers through the soil. It was loose and dry, almost as if it had been deliberately sifted. Around the edges of the site, he found more broken chain links, scraps of metal, and a few scattered pieces of plastic tubing. The tubing was coated in a fine, powdery residue that made Cole's fingers itch. He didn't know what it was, but it left him uneasy. Frustrated, Cole grabbed his phone and took more pictures of the site and the tire tracks. He tried calling Mason to confront him directly, but as expected, the call went straight to voicemail. Mason wasn't going to answer, not unless it suited him. By mid-morning, Cole had decided to take another step to protect his land. He called the sheriff's office and asked for an officer to come out and take a look at the damage. He figured it was time to get an official record of what was happening, even if Mason tried to spin it as some kind of misunderstanding. When Deputy Mark Sandler arrived a few hours later, Cole walked him through the situation, pointing out the gate, the tracks, and the damage to his fields. Sandler, a tall man with a gruff demeanor, listened carefully and took notes as Cole explained the timeline of events. "You've got photos of everything?" Sandler asked, glancing toward the gate with a raised brow. "I do," Cole said, handing over his phone. "And I've got a surveyor's report that proves the gate and the tracks are on my land. Mason has no right to be here." Sandler scrolled through the photos, nodding occasionally. "This is pretty clear-cut," he said. "But here's the thing, unless you can prove he's actively stealing or damaging property, and I mean something tangible, it's going to be tough to get this into court. What he's doing might be unethical, but it's not necessarily illegal. Yet." Cole frowned, his frustration mounting. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let him keep tearing up my land?" Sandler shook his head. "Not at all. I'll file a report, and we'll make sure there's an official record of what's going on. That way, if things escalate, and let's be honest, they probably will, you've got documentation to back up your case. In the meantime, I'd suggest reinforcing your boundaries. Maybe put up some cameras to get eyes on what's happening when you're not around." The suggestion of cameras wasn't exactly what Cole wanted to hear. It felt passive, like a concession. But Sandler was right about one thing: Mason wasn't going to back down, and Cole needed to be ready for whatever came next. That evening, Cole drove into town and picked up a set of motion-activated cameras. They weren't high-end, but they'd do the job. He spent the better part of the night installing them along the eastern edge of the property, focusing on the gate and the dirt path Mason's vehicle seemed to favor. By the time he was finished, it was well past midnight, and the stars above seemed impossibly bright against the dark sky. The next morning, Cole woke to the sound of an engine rumbling in the distance. He grabbed his boots and rushed outside, his heart pounding. Sure enough, a large flatbed truck was parked just beyond the gate, its rear wheels half buried in the soft earth of his field. Two men in work clothes were unloading what looked like large concrete blocks from the back of the truck. Cole's anger flared as he stormed toward the gate. "Hey," he shouted, his voice cutting through the crisp morning air. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The two men looked up, startled. One of them, a burly man with a scruffy beard, stepped forward. "We're just doing our job, pal. Mason hired us to drop these off." "On my land," Cole snapped. "You've got no business being here. Turn that truck around and take this crap with you." The man held up his hands defensively. "Look, I don't want any trouble. We're just following orders." "Well, your orders are wrong," Cole said, his voice firm. "This is private property and I'm telling you to leave. Now." The man hesitated, glancing back at his partner, who was already climbing into the truck's cab. All right, he muttered. "We're going." Cole watched as the truck rumbled back toward Mason's property, leaving deep ruts in its wake. Once it was out of sight, he turned his attention to the concrete blocks the men had left behind. There were 6 of them, each one massive and clearly meant for some kind of construction project. As he inspected the blocks, Cole noticed something strange. Each block was stamped with a serial number and a logo he didn't recognize. It wasn't from any local supplier he knew, and the fact that Mason was bringing in materials from outside the area only made Cole more suspicious. That night, Cole reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras. Most of it was uneventful, just the occasional deer wandering through the fields. But around midnight, the cameras had captured something that made Cole's blood run cold. Two men, dressed in dark clothing, had walked onto his property from Mason's side of the fence. They weren't carrying tools or equipment, but their movements were deliberate, almost methodical. One of them stopped near the disturbed soil, crouching down as though he were inspecting something. The other stayed near the gate, glancing around nervously. The footage ended with the two men walking back through the gate and disappearing into the night. Cole felt a knot tighten in his chest. Mason's actions weren't just reckless, they were calculated. Whatever was happening on his land was more than a simple boundary dispute. Mason was planning something, and Cole had no intention of sitting back and waiting to find out what it was. Cole didn't sleep that night. The footage from his cameras replayed in his mind on an endless loop, the two men moving across his land under the cover of darkness, their cautious but purposeful actions raising more questions than answers. Mason wasn't just trespassing anymore. He was orchestrating something bigger, something that felt calculated and far beyond a simple neighborly dispute. By morning, Cole had formulated a plan. He wasn't going to let this go unchecked any longer. Mason had pushed too far, and it was time to fight back. Cole contacted Tom Wiggins, the surveyor, to share the footage and update him on the latest developments. Tom agreed to come by later in the week to help Cole prepare a formal complaint to submit to the county. But Cole knew this was only one piece of the puzzle. If Mason was bold enough to send men onto his property in the dead of night, it meant he was confident in whatever plan he was setting into motion. That confidence needed to be shaken. The first step was figuring out what Mason's new barn was really for. The massive structure had been going up quickly, with deliveries of materials happening almost daily. Mason had told the county it was for agricultural storage, but something about it didn't add up. The barn was far larger than anything Mason's existing farming operation would require, and the timing of its construction right as he began encroaching on Cole's land was too convenient to ignore. Cole decided to get a closer look. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he drove his truck to the edge of his property, parking just out of sight of Mason's sprawling estate. He walked the rest of the way, keeping low as he approached the construction site. The barn's skeleton loomed against the darkening sky, its beams and supports casting long shadows over the surrounding area. Workers were still present, though fewer than during the day. Cole could see a couple of men unloading crates from a delivery truck and stacking them inside the partially completed structure. He stayed hidden, crouching behind a row of bushes as he watched. The crates were unmarked, but their size and the way the workers handled them suggested they weren't light. Whatever was inside wasn't ordinary farm equipment. Cole's stomach churned. He was treading on dangerous ground, but he couldn't let the opportunity slip by. As the workers moved out of sight, he crept closer to the barn, sticking to the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached one of the crates, which had been left temporarily outside the barn's entrance. He knelt and examined it, running his hand along the rough wooden surface. There were no markings, no labels, but the lid was held shut with industrial-grade nails that suggested something valuable or dangerous was inside. Before he could investigate further, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, what are you doing there?" Cole froze, his pulse spiking as he turned to see one of Mason's workers walking toward him, a flashlight in hand. The beam of light swept across the ground, landing squarely on Cole. He stood quickly, raising his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Easy," Cole said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm just checking on something." Checking on what the worker demanded, his tone suspicious. He stopped a few feet away, the flashlight still trained on Cole's face. Cole thought fast. "Mason's been running equipment through my land," he said. "I came to see if he's still at it." The worker frowned, lowering the flashlight slightly. "You're the guy with the farm next door." "That's right," Cole said. "And if Mason's got nothing to hide, he won't mind me taking a look." The worker hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. After a tense moment, he grunted and gestured toward the barn. "You'll need to talk to Mason about that. This isn't my business." Cole nodded, backing away slowly. "I'll do that," he said, keeping his tone calm. "Just tell him I was here." The worker watched him go. and Cole felt the man's eyes on his back until he was out of sight. As soon as he was clear of the construction site, he broke into a brisk walk, his mind racing. He hadn't gotten the answers he wanted, but the encounter had confirmed his suspicions. Whatever Mason was building, he didn't want anyone looking too closely. The next morning, Cole called his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Cartwright, who had a reputation for handling property disputes with ruthless efficiency. He explained everything: Mason's gate, the tire tracks, the disturbed soil, the unmarked crates, and the nighttime intruders. Linda listened intently, interrupting only to ask clarifying questions. "Here's the thing," she said once Cole had finished. "You've got enough to file a formal complaint, but it's going to take time for the county to process it. Mason knows that, which is why he's moving fast. He's trying to get whatever he's doing finished before anyone can stop him." "So what do I do in the meantime?" Cole asked. Linda paused. "You make it hard for him to move forward. Document everything. Keep the pressure on, and if he tries anything else, call the sheriff immediately. The more evidence you have, the better your chances of shutting this down." Cole took her advice to heart. Over the next few days, he redoubled his efforts to monitor Mason's activities. He moved his cameras to better vantage points, capturing clearer footage of the vehicles and workers crossing onto his property. He also spoke with some of his neighbors, hoping to rally support. Most of them sympathized with Cole but were hesitant to get involved. Mason had a way of intimidating people, and few were willing to risk his wrath. One neighbor, however, offered a lead. Marjorie Quinn, an elderly woman who had lived in the area her whole life, mentioned that Mason had been meeting with developers in town. "They're always talking about expansion," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He's got big plans, that one. Doesn't care who he steps on to get what he wants." The mention of developers sent a chill through Cole. He'd assumed Mason's actions were tied to his own farming operation, but if developers were involved, it meant the stakes were higher than he'd realized. Mason wasn't just looking to use Cole's land, he was likely preparing to sell it, along with his own, to someone with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. That night, Cole reviewed the latest footage from his cameras. What he saw only deepened his sense of urgency. The two men from before had returned, this time with tools. They spent hours working near the disturbed soil, their movements precise and deliberate. At one point, they uncovered a large object buried in the ground, something rectangular and metallic. Cole couldn't make out the details, but it was clear they were extracting it carefully, as though it were valuable. The footage ended with the men loading the object onto a truck and driving it back through the gate onto Mason's property. Cole's hands clenched into fists as he watched the screen go dark. Mason wasn't just trespassing. He was digging, uncovering something on Cole's land without permission. It wasn't just a violation of property rights, it was theft. The next morning, Cole called Linda again, forwarding her the footage. "This changes everything," she said after reviewing it. "If Mason's removing things from your land, that's a criminal matter. We're going to bring this to the sheriff right away." Cole agreed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already running out of time. Whatever Mason was after, he was moving fast, and Cole needed to act even faster if he wanted to stop him. The fight was far from over, and Cole knew the hardest battles were still ahead. The tension between Cole and Mason had grown so thick it felt like a storm waiting to break. Every morning, Cole woke up with the same gnawing feeling in his gut that Mason was getting bolder, more reckless, and that time was running out to stop whatever he was planning. A week after discovering the footage of the men digging on his land, Cole received an unexpected blow. As he was working in his barn, patching a broken fence post, he noticed something unusual near the small pond at the edge of his property. The water level had dropped significantly, leaving muddy banks exposed. Confused, he walked closer to investigate. That's when he saw it. The outlet pipe that fed water from the nearby creek into the pond had been capped off with concrete. Someone had deliberately sealed it, cutting off the flow and drying out his only source of water for irrigation. His heart sank as he realized what this meant. Without water, his crops would wither, and his farm would be left in ruins. Cole didn't have to think hard to figure out who was responsible. Mason had been angling to make his life difficult from the moment he installed that gate. This was just another tactic in his growing list of transgressions. Furious, Cole snapped pictures of the sealed pipe and immediately called the sheriff's office. Deputy Sandler arrived within the hour, his usual stoic demeanor betraying a flicker of irritation as Cole showed him the damage. "This is sabotage," Cole said, his voice tight with anger. "He's trying to choke my farm into submission." Sandler nodded slowly. "It certainly looks deliberate," he said, crouching by the edge of the pond to examine the concrete cap. "But without direct evidence linking this to Mason, it's going to be tough to pin it on him. You're sure you haven't seen anyone else around the property?" Cole shook his head, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "No, but who else would benefit from this? He's the only one with a reason to pull something like this." "I don't disagree," Sandler said, standing and brushing off his hands. "But you know how this works, Cole. We need more than suspicion to build a case." It was the same answer Cole had heard before, and it did little to ease his frustration. He thanked Sandler for his time and watched him drive away, feeling more determined than ever to put a stop to Mason's games. That night, Cole reviewed the footage from his cameras, hoping to find anything that might tie Mason to the sabotage. Hours passed as he combed through the clips, his eyes growing tired from staring at the screen. Finally, just after midnight, he found what he was looking for. The cameras had captured two men walking near the pond under the cover of darkness, carrying what looked like buckets of cement and a long piece of piping. They worked quickly, their movements practiced and efficient, before disappearing back through the gate leading to Mason's property. Cole forwarded the footage to Linda Cartwright first thing in the morning. When she called him back later that day, her tone was sharp and focused. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "We can use this to push for an injunction against Mason. He's not just trespassing anymore, he's actively damaging your property." Cole felt a flicker of relief at her words, but it was short-lived. Later that afternoon, as he was out repairing the pond's outlet pipe, he heard the rumble of engines approaching from the direction of Mason's land. Turning toward the noise, he saw a convoy of trucks heading toward the gate. They stopped just short of the fence, and a group of workers began unloading materials: more concrete blocks, steel beams, and heavy machinery. Before Cole could say a word, Mason appeared, stepping out of a sleek black pickup truck with his usual smug grin plastered across his face. "Afternoon, Cole," he said, leaning casually against the truck's door. "Busy day, huh?" Cole marched up to the gate, his fists clenched at his sides. "What the hell do you think you're doing now?" "Just making some improvements," Mason said, gesturing toward the trucks. "Nothing you need to worry about." "This is my land," Mason Cole growled. "You don't get to just waltz in here and do whatever you want." Mason's grin didn't falter. "Funny thing about that," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "According to this, it's not just your land anymore. Turns out, part of it falls under shared jurisdiction. County approved, of course." Cole snatched the paper from Mason's hand, his eyes scanning the text. It was an official-looking document, stamped and signed by someone in the county office, claiming that a portion of Cole's property was now designated as a shared access zone for community development purposes. "This is bullshit," Cole said, his voice shaking with anger. "I didn't agree to any of this." "Didn't have to," Mason replied, his tone infuriatingly calm. "It's all above board. Feel free to check with the county if you don't believe me." Cole crumpled the paper in his hand, his mind racing. This was beyond anything Mason had done before. It wasn't just trespassing or sabotage anymore. It was a blatant attempt to rewrite the rules and steal his land right out from under him. That evening, Cole called Linda again, explaining the latest development. Her reaction was immediate and decisive. "That document is garbage," she said. "There's no way the county can unilaterally change property designations without your consent. Mason's trying to intimidate you, plain and simple." "But what if it's real?" Cole asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "It's not," Linda said firmly. "I'll start digging into this first thing tomorrow, but in the meantime, don't let him push you around. If he tries to move anything else onto your land, call the sheriff." Again. Cole followed her advice, but Mason wasn't making it easy. Over the next few days, the trucks kept coming, hauling in more materials and equipment. Mason's workers moved with military precision, clearing paths and setting up temporary structures on Cole's land as though they had every right to be there. Despite the chaos, Cole refused to back down. He spent his nights monitoring the cameras and his days documenting every infraction, building a mountain of evidence to take to the authorities. He even reached out to a local environmental group, hoping to draw attention to Mason's actions. The breakthrough came 2 days later when Linda called with good news. "I found out where that bogus document came from," she said. "Mason bribed someone in the county office to draft it. I've got emails and payment records to prove it." Cole felt a surge of relief at her words, but the fight wasn't over yet. With Linda's help, he filed an emergency injunction to halt Mason's activities, but the wheels of justice moved slowly. In the meantime, Mason's workers continued their relentless progress, as if daring Cole to stop them. It all came to a head one evening when Cole returned from town to find one of Mason's trucks parked in the middle of his field. A large trench had been dug along the edge of the property, cutting off access to one of his main irrigation lines. Furious, Cole called the sheriff's office again, demanding immediate action. When Deputy Sandler arrived, he brought backup this time, and the sight of 2 patrol cars finally seemed to rattle Mason's workers. They scrambled to load their equipment back onto the trucks as Sandler questioned Mason, who maintained his usual air of smug confidence. By the end of the night, the workers were gone, the trench was filled, and Sandler had filed yet another report against Mason. But Cole knew this wasn't the end. Mason had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. As Cole stood at the edge of his field, staring at the damage left behind, he made a silent vow. Mason might have deep pockets and connections in high places, but Cole wasn't going to let him win. Not now, not ever. The day the court hearing for the emergency injunction finally arrived, Cole felt a mixture of determination and dread. Linda had assured him that they had a strong case between the camera footage, surveyors' reports, and proof of Mason's forged documents. The evidence was on their side. Still, Mason's confidence throughout the entire ordeal gnawed at him. It wasn't just arrogance, it was the kind of assuredness that came from knowing you had power, connections, or both. The courtroom was small, a utilitarian space with no frills to distract from the proceedings. Mason arrived with a polished lawyer in tow, a man who exuded an air of superiority, as if victory was already assured. Cole sat beside Linda, who was flipping through her meticulously prepared notes, her sharp gaze fixed on the front of the room. The proceedings began with Linda laying out the facts. Mason had installed a gate on Cole's property without permission, repeatedly trespassed, and caused significant damage, all while attempting to alter legal boundaries through fraudulent means. She presented the evidence methodically, walking the judge through every step of Mason's escalating actions, supported by clear documentation. Mason's lawyer countered with a casual dismissal of the accusations, claiming the gate was a misunderstanding, the construction work was done in good faith, and the disputed boundary was an administrative error. He even tried to paint Cole as an overly territorial farmer unwilling to cooperate with his neighbors. But then Linda dropped the bombshell. With a triumphant tone, she presented emails and payment records that proved Mason had bribed a county official to draft the fraudulent property designation. She handed the documents to the judge, whose previously neutral expression hardened as he skimmed through them. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the smug grin he'd worn for weeks finally faltering. The judge didn't mince words. "This is a blatant abuse of power and a deliberate attempt to circumvent property laws. The injunction is granted, effective immediately. Mr. Reed, you are ordered to cease all activities on Mr. Hansen's property, remove any unauthorized structures, and compensate him for the damages caused. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of document forgery and bribery to the district attorney for criminal investigation." The gavel hit the block, and it was over. Cole exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. Mason stormed out of the courtroom without a word, his lawyer trailing behind him. But the relief was short-lived. 2 nights later, Cole woke to the sound of an engine roaring in the distance. He bolted out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and ran outside. The smell of diesel and the faint glow of headlights led him to the eastern side of his property. There, under the cover of darkness, a group of men was tearing down his fence. They worked quickly, cutting through the posts with chainsaws and hauling them away in trucks. Cole shouted at them, his voice echoing across the fields, but they didn't stop. One of the men turned, his face obscured by a mask, and gestured to the others to speed up. Cole sprinted back to the house to grab his phone and call the sheriff, his hands trembling with anger and fear. As he waited for the deputies to arrive, he grabbed his camera and began taking photos of the destruction, capturing the masked men as they loaded the last of the fence posts onto their trucks and sped off into the night. When Deputy Sandler arrived with his team, the damage was evident. The eastern side of Cole's property was exposed, the fence reduced to a series of jagged stumps. Sandler surveyed the scene grimly, taking notes as Cole recounted what had happened. "This isn't just about a property dispute anymore," Sandler said. "This is criminal vandalism, plain and simple. We'll get a warrant for Mason's property and see what we can find." The next day, armed with the warrant, Sandler and his deputies searched Mason's property. What they found was damning piles of cut fence posts, heavy machinery that matched the tire tracks on Cole's land, and even some of the unmarked crates Mason's workers had been hauling. But the most shocking discovery was buried near the edge of Mason's property, a storage container filled with barrels of industrial chemicals. The barrels were leaking into the soil, contaminating not just Mason's land but also the water table that fed into Cole's irrigation pond. Environmental inspectors were called in, and their preliminary assessment confirmed the worst Mason's reckless actions had caused severe environmental damage, violating multiple state and federal regulations. The fallout was swift. Mason was arrested for vandalism, environmental violations, and his role in forging county documents. His empire of shady deals and intimidation tactics crumbled almost overnight. For Cole, the victory was bittersweet. The damage to his land was extensive, and it would take years to fully restore. But as he stood at the edge of his property, watching the sheriff's deputies cart away the last of Mason's equipment, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Mason had underestimated him, thinking his wealth and connections made him untouchable. But Cole's determination, his unwillingness to back down, had turned the tide. His farm, his family's legacy was safe, and justice had finally been served. In the weeks following Mason's arrest, the dust began to settle on Cole's farm. The gaping wound left by the destroyed fence was patched, the land surveyed once again to ensure no further encroachments, and the construction debris Mason had abandoned was cleared away by court order. Cole worked tirelessly to repair what had been damaged, but the scars remained on the land and in his mind. The victory had come at a cost. While the court awarded Cole damages for the destruction Mason had caused, money didn't bring back the lost crops, the contaminated soil, or the countless sleepless nights. The pond still showed traces of the chemicals that had leaked into it, and Cole had to bring in environmental specialists to restore its balance. It would take years for the land to fully recover, but Cole was determined to see it through. The community, which had once been wary of getting involved, rallied behind Cole in the aftermath. Neighbors stopped by to offer their support, some bringing meals or lending equipment to help with repairs. Even those who had previously kept their distance from the conflict now expressed their admiration for how Cole had stood his ground. "You showed all of us what it means to fight for what's right," Marjorie Quinn said one afternoon as she handed Cole a fresh baked pie. "People like Mason think they can do whatever they want because they've got money and power, but you proved them wrong." Cole nodded, grateful for her words but still feeling the weight of the battle he'd fought. The farm was safe, yes, but it had come close to being lost. That thought lingered in his mind, driving him to fortify the property even further. Over the next few months, Cole installed reinforced fencing along every boundary of his land, leaving no weak points that could be exploited. He upgraded his camera system and worked with Linda to review the legal protections for his property, ensuring there were no loopholes someone like Mason could exploit in the future. The legal proceedings against Mason dragged on, as such cases often do. While he remained in custody awaiting trial, the news of his misdeeds spread far and wide. Reports detailed his attempts to bribe officials, his illegal use of chemicals, and the environmental destruction he had caused. His reputation in the community was ruined, and his assets were frozen as investigations uncovered more of his shady dealings. For Cole, the most satisfying moment came when the county issued a public apology for failing to catch Mason's illegal activities sooner. Representatives from the local government visited his farm to offer their assurances that they were tightening regulations and increasing oversight to prevent future abuses. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step in the right direction. As the seasons turned, Cole found solace in returning to the rhythms of farm life. The fields began to recover, green shoots sprouting from the freshly tilled soil. The livestock, which had been stressed during the chaos, settled back into their routines. Slowly but surely, the farm began to feel like home again. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Cole sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was cool, the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves filling the quiet. He gazed out over his land, the fences standing tall, the fields stretching out like a testament to his perseverance. This farm wasn't just his livelihood, it was his identity, his family's legacy, and his anchor in a world that often felt unpredictable and unfair. Mason had tried to take that from him, but Cole had fought back, not with brute force but with resilience, strategy, and the unwavering belief that justice was worth pursuing. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The fight had been hard, but he'd won. His farm was safe, his community stronger, and his determination to protect what mattered most had only grown. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Cole stood and headed inside, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. This land was his, and he would never stop fighting for it.